So I know you guys are probably sad that you can't actually see me in this video, but I want to make sure that you can understand everything that's on the slide presented to you. So we often hear terms like API or database query, right? But rarely do we exactly see how a piece of information travels from a user's keyboard across the internet and then into a permanent storage vault. And we call this journey data in motion. But by the end of this, you'll understand the technical architecture that powers modern applications. So the first thing though is, what is an API? So we have to define the core mechanism, right? So if you've ever been to a restaurant, for example, you already understand this concept. And I'm going to use this to illustrate it. So you, the customer, are the client, right? So you want something specific. So the kitchen is the database, and that's where the raw goods kind of live. But you cannot just walk into the kitchen and start grabbing ingredients, obviously unless you own the kitchen, but you need an interface. So the waiter is the API. So they're going to take your specific order, validate that's on the menu, then take it to the kitchen and bring back exactly what you asked for. So in software, the API is simply the messenger that ensures the client and the database never touch directly, but the information is facilitated. So next we have the big picture architecture. So let's look at the actual technical architecture, because modern software is not just one big block. It's separated into three distinct pillars. So first you have the front end. So this is the browser app you interact with. So when you log into a website. Second is going to be the back end. So this is the API server. So the brains of the operation that handles security and the logic. And the third is the database. So that's the warehouse where the data lives permanently. So these three layers communicate strictly through messages, and they do not share memory. They simply pass notes back and forth like we kind of did in high school, right? Now, how do we start this communication though? So if we're on the front end in a web browser, we use JavaScript. That's the standard tool for this, is a function called fetch. So in JavaScript, that's the code that you use to actually fetch things and call things. So if you look at the code on the screen, the most critical word here is await. So when we ask the server for data, it takes time, milliseconds or even seconds. The await command tells the code to pause right there. Don't move forward and wait until the signal travels across the world and comes back. Once it returns, we convert the raw signal into JSON data that we can read. So you're probably wondering what JSON even is, and if you don't know, that's fine. That's just how data transfers across the web. Now, that's how you do it in JavaScript, right? So let's talk about Python. Now, if we're on the back end or running an automation script, we typically use Python. Python uses a library card called request. The logic is similar, but the explicit check is status underscore code and then equaling 200. So 200 actually means success in web terms. And we basically say attempt to get the data. If the server replies with success, then you open the data. This prevents our script from crashing if the internet goes down or the server is offline. But next we have the write operation. So we discussed reading data, right, and pulling it down. Now we need to discuss the harder part, which is writing the data. So how do we take a new email address typed by a user and save it permanently? So this is the write operation. So this journey is stricter because we are modifying the permanent record, and it requires a specific 4-step lifecycle. So step 1 of that is going to be the payload. So the journey begins with the payload when a user types their email and hit save. So think about all the times you go in and save your profile, right? The browser doesn't send raw text. It packages that input into a format called JSON, we talked about earlier, which is JavaScript object notation. You can see it on the right. It basically wraps the data in curly braces with a key and a value. This is the universal language of the web. So it's lightweight, it's organized, and every server in the world knows how to read it. Next up, we have the gatekeeper. So step 2 is going to be validation. So the API receives the JSON package before it even looks at the database. It acts as a gatekeeper. So I ask 2 questions first. So 1, who are you? Checking your login token, right? And second, is this data safe? Ensuring that the email has an @ symbol and it isn't malicious code. You also have things on the front end that ensure that the input is correct as well, which is where you have guardrails too, right? But if the data fails these checks, the API rejects it immediately, and the database is never even bothered. Step 3 is going to be persistent. So if the data is valid, we then move forward. This is the only time the database is involved. The API opens a connection to the SQL or NoSQL database and translates that JSON package into a database command like update and users set email, and this physically writes the information onto the hard drive of the server, making the change permanent. Next is going to be the confirmation. So the database tells the API the job is done, but the user doesn't know that yet. The API must send a signal back to the browser. So if everything worked, it sends a 200 OK. If the user made a mistake, it sends a 400 bad request. The browser waits for the specific code before it updates the screen to say profile saved. So if you've ever had an incident where you've seen a bad request or something doesn't save properly, it's probably because it's not talking to the database correctly, or there's even a bad input that was done. So to summarize, data movement is a loop. So it starts with a request, JavaScript firing a JSON payload across the wire, right? It moves to process the API, validating, securing the data before talking to the database, and it ends with the response, the system confirming the action was successful. Unfortunately, not all actually do, unless you have that bad request come in. That's kind of default, right? Understanding this loop is the foundation, though, of all technical troubleshooting and development. So now we know that data can be inputted on the browser itself, on the website application that you're running on, and pushes to the database to create authoritative information, or it can be done somewhere else, right? But it's a life cycle of movement of data. With that said, hopefully this video helped you out. Let me know your thoughts down below. And as always, thanks for watching.